On the second morning of March 1819, a portrait painter named Margaret Ashby was told, in front of the entire household staff, to leave the mistress of Elsmore out of the family canvas entirely. She was the poor relation kept on as a companion, tolerated for her needlework and her quiet hands, never once asked to sit for a likeness in 19 years under that roof. The Ashby family held the house, the name, and every shilling she depended on to eat. Everyone expected her to nod, pack her paints, and disappear into the servants' corridor as she always had. What the Duke of Halworth did instead, arriving unannounced at the very hour the family gathered for their portrait, would be spoken of in 3 counties for the rest of that decade. The family had gathered 30 guests that morning to watch the sitting, certain the Duke had come only to inspect his cousin's likeness before the wedding portrait was commissioned. Lady Constance Ashby, who ran the household with a ledger's precision and a viper's tongue, had told Margaret plainly the week before that a woman without a dowry had no business appearing in any painting meant to last. Everyone in that room agreed the poor cousin had been handed a burden the family would carry out of charity alone, nothing more. The Duke was known through the county as a man who spoke perhaps 9 words a day and trusted no one past his own steward. What happened when his gaze crossed the room and did not move from Margaret's face would unravel everything the Ashbys believed about their own standing by the time the candles were lit that same night. Margaret had learned long ago to make herself small in that house, to fold her hands and stand where the light did not reach her, because being noticed had only ever brought trouble down on her head. She kept her brushes in a wooden box her father had left her, the only inheritance anyone in the family had never managed to take away, and she painted in the hours before dawn when no one required anything of her. The Duke of Halworth was a name spoken with a kind of careful dread in that house, a man whose wife had died 3 winters past, and whose estate at Halworth Park was said to be silent as a tomb. Nobody in the drawing room that morning believed he had come for anything but business, and nobody believed Margaret Ashby had any part to play in whatever that business was. Then the Duke crossed the room, past Lady Constance's outstretched hand, and past the daughter dressed for the sitting, and stopped in front of the one woman no one had thought to introduce. He asked, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room, whether she was the one who had painted the miniature of the old vicar that hung in the village church, the one he had stood before for an hour the previous autumn without anyone knowing his name. Margaret's answer came quiet and certain, and the room seemed to hold its breath around the two of them. Lady Constance's face went the color of chalk, because she understood before anyone else in that room what was about to happen, and there was nothing left in her power to stop it. Margaret Ashby had come to Elsmore at the age of 11, the year her father's shipping investments collapsed, and her mother followed him into the grave within the same winter, both of them buried in a churchyard too far from the estate for anyone to visit more than once a year. She arrived with a single trunk, a paint box that rattled with half-used pigments, and a letter from her father's solicitor asking the Ashbys, as the nearest blood relation, to take her in out of Christian duty. Lady Constance had read that letter twice at the breakfast table and decided, before Margaret's carriage had even reached the gates, exactly what shape that duty would take. There would be no dowry set aside for her, no seasons in London, no place at the family table when guests of consequence came to dine. She would eat with the governess, sleep in the room above the linen store, and make herself useful with her needle, since the household had precious little use for a girl who could do nothing else of value. Margaret learned the rules of that house within a month, the way a person learns to walk quietly in a home where every floorboard has a name, and every name belongs to someone who might report her. She learned which doors she could pass through and which required a reason. She learned that the drawing room portraits, updated every few years by whichever painter fashion favored, existed to record a family that did not include her, and that asking to be included was the fastest way to remind Lady Constance that she was tolerated, not wanted. What the household never learned, because Margaret took great care that they should not, was that she had gone on painting anyway. In the hour before the house woke, in the corner of the old nursery no one used since the youngest Ashby had grown, she painted the gardener's spaniel and the elm tree that split lightning white after the storm of 1814, and, once, from memory alone, the face of her mother, as she remembered it from a miniature that had gone missing somewhere between the old house and the new. She painted in secret because a girl with no dowry who spent her mornings at an easel instead of at her needle was a girl inviting comment, and comment in that house always arrived sharpened. The vicar had found her out by accident, 3 years before the Duke ever set foot in Elsmore, when he came upon her sketching the churchyard yews on a Sunday afternoon, and asked, gently, whether she might attempt his likeness for the parish records. She had said yes before she had time to be afraid of saying yes, and the miniature she produced, small and plain-framed, still hung in the vestry where anyone might see it, though almost no one who saw it thought to ask who had painted it. Margaret had stopped expecting recognition somewhere around her 16th year. She had decided, quietly and without self-pity, that a life spent unseen was still a life, and that the painting itself was the reward, not whatever anyone said about it afterward. She did not know, on the morning the family gathered for their portrait sitting, that a stranger had stood before that vestry miniature for the better part of an hour the previous autumn, asking the sexton questions he had no obvious reason to ask. The Duke of Halworth had not always been a man of 9 words a day. Those who remembered him from before his marriage spoke of a young lord who laughed easily and rode too fast down the lanes toward Halworth Park, a man whose father despaired of ever making him serious. The change came after his wife Eleanor died in the 3rd year of their marriage, delivered of a child who did not survive the same night, and the county watched him retreat behind the walls of his estate, the way a wounded animal retreats into deep woods to heal or to die, no one quite certain which. He conducted his affairs by letter where he could manage it. He attended the assemblies and dinners his rank required, and said as little as courtesy allowed, and left as early as courtesy allowed, and the mothers of eligible daughters had long since stopped angling for his attention, because angling for a wall produced nothing but exhaustion. What almost no one in the county knew, because he had told no one and had no wish to be known, was that Eleanor had loved painting more than she had loved almost anything else in her short life, and that in the year before she died, she had begun, haltingly, to teach him to see the way she saw, to notice how light changed the color of a stone wall across an afternoon, to understand why a brushstroke mattered. He had kept every sketch she left unfinished. He had converted her morning room at Halworth Park into a gallery that no visitor was permitted to enter, and he went there some evenings simply to stand among the unfinished work and remember a version of himself that had not yet learned to be afraid of loving anything. It was on one such evening, restless and unable to settle into the account books his steward had left for his signature, that he had ridden out with no particular destination, and found himself, an hour later, in a village church 3 parishes from his own, staring at a miniature of an old vicar that had been painted with more honesty than any portrait he had commissioned in his life. The brushwork was untrained in places, the composition modest, but the eyes in that small painting held something he recognized immediately and could not have named if pressed, a kind of seeing that refused to flatter and refused to look away. He had asked the sexton who painted it and received only a shrug and a guess. A relation of the Ashbys up at Elsmore, might be the companion, hard to say. He had ridden home that night with the name Ashby lodged in his mind like a splinter, and he had told himself for months afterward that it meant nothing, that a man in his position did not go chasing a name attached to a country miniature. He had told himself that until the invitation to the Elsmore portrait sitting arrived on his desk, addressed to him as a courtesy since his estate bordered theirs, and he had accepted before he allowed himself to examine why. The morning of the sitting arrived gray and close, the kind of English spring day that could not decide between rain and reprieve, and Elsmore's household had been turned upside down since dawn preparing for it. Lady Constance had chosen the drawing room for its northern light, had the good rug beaten and relaid, had the silver polished twice because the first polishing had not satisfied her, and had personally supervised the dressing of her daughter Henrietta, the intended centerpiece of the family canvas now that her engagement to a baronet's son had been announced. Margaret spent the morning as she spent every morning of consequence in that house, useful and invisible, pinning hems and fetching gloves and standing ready to be summoned for whatever small task required hands that were not considered worth painting. She had long since stopped hoping to be included in the family portraits, though something in her chest still tightened every time the painter arrived and set up an easel that would never once turn in her direction. She busied herself instead with practical matters, checking that the refreshments were laid correctly, making certain the youngest Ashby cousin did not wander into the room in his nursery clothes and embarrass his mother in front of the guests already arriving. 30 of them came that morning, neighbors and connections and 2 families from the next county who had heard the Ashbys were sparing no expense, all of them settling into chairs arranged to give an unobstructed view of the sitting, all of them murmuring about the weather and the engagement, and, here and there, in voices not quite low enough, about the pale companion moving among them with a tray of refreshments, as though she were one of the staff rather than family. Margaret had grown a kind of skin against such murmurs over the years, thick enough that most of them slid off her without leaving a mark, though a few still found their way through, the way a splinter finds skin no matter how careful the hands. She heard Lady Constance, near the mantel, telling a visiting matron that the girl was a Ashby only by the thinnest technicality of blood, that the family had done more than duty required in keeping her fed and housed all these years, that a woman without prospects learned gratitude, or she learned nothing useful at all. Margaret kept her eyes on the tray in her hands and her face perfectly still, because stillness was the only defense she had ever been permitted to develop, and she was still holding that stillness, still moving quietly toward the sideboard, when the front doors opened without any footman announcing a carriage, and the entire room turned as one toward the sound. The Duke of Halworth stood in the doorway for a long moment before anyone thought to move, his greatcoat still damp from the ride, his presence so unexpected that the room seemed to forget, collectively, how to breathe. Lady Constance recovered first, sweeping toward him with the particular warmth she reserved for men of significant rank, apologizing for the disorder of an unannounced visit while simultaneously arranging, with remarkable speed, for a chair to be brought forward and Henrietta to be repositioned nearer the light. The Duke accepted none of it. He inclined his head to Lady Constance with the minimum courtesy the situation demanded, and then let his gaze move, slow and deliberate, across the assembled guests, past Henrietta arranged prettily by the window, past the painter already fussing with his palette, until it reached the sideboard, where Margaret stood frozen, with a tray of untouched refreshments in her hands. He did not look away. Lady Constance, following the line of his attention with visible confusion, attempted to redirect him with talk of the engagement, the wedding portrait that would follow this sitting, the excellent match her daughter had made, and the Duke answered none of it, crossing the room instead in a silence so complete that even the youngest guests fell still. He stopped a respectful distance from Margaret and asked, in that voice that carried without effort, whether she was the same Ashby who had painted the vicar's likeness in the parish church 3 valleys from here. The room did not merely go quiet. It went the particular stillness of a held breath, 30 guests suspended between curiosity and the dawning understanding that something significant was unfolding in front of them, something none of them had come prepared to witness. Margaret set down the tray with hands that did not entirely obey her and answered that she was, her voice smaller than she intended but steady enough to carry. The Duke studied her for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, some guard easing that the room could see even if it could not name what it was seeing. He turned then to the painter arranging his canvas by the window and said that he would not be requiring a family portrait that day. He said he had come, instead, to commission a portrait of his own, and that the artist he wished to engage was standing by the sideboard if she would consent to the work. Lady Constance's composure did not merely crack, it shattered so visibly that several guests looked away out of something like mercy, and Henrietta, still arranged by the window in her wedding portrait finery, stood forgotten by every eye in the room while her mother searched for words that would not come. The silence that followed the Duke's announcement lasted long enough for Margaret to feel every eye in the room settle on her at once, a sensation so unfamiliar after 19 years of practiced invisibility that she nearly stepped backward into the sideboard behind her. Lady Constance found her voice before Margaret found her own, insisting with a brittle laugh that the Duke surely misunderstood the situation, that Margaret was family, not a tradeswoman to be hired, and that whatever charming notion had brought him across the county this morning could certainly be reconsidered over tea. The Duke did not so much as glance in her direction. He kept his attention on Margaret and asked, with a formality that felt strangely gentle given the weight of every gaze in the room, whether she would consent to paint his likeness at Halworth Park, on terms and payment to be agreed as with any commissioned artist. Margaret understood, even as her mind scrambled to catch up with the moment, that this was not merely an invitation. It was, in front of 30 witnesses and the family that had spent 19 years teaching her to expect nothing, a public declaration that her work had value, that she had value, delivered by a man whose opinion no one in that room would dare dismiss. She understood, too, with the sharper instinct that years of careful survival had honed in her, that saying yes would change everything about her position in that house, and possibly not in ways that were safe. Lady Constance's eyes, fixed on her from across the room, carried a warning plain enough to read even through the shock still working across her face. Margaret looked at the Duke and asked, quietly, whether he understood that she had no formal training, no reputation beyond a single miniature in a country church, nothing to recommend her but the work itself. He answered that the work was precisely what he had come to see, and that reputation was a thing other men chased because they lacked the patience to look at what was actually in front of them. Something in the plainness of that answer settled something in Margaret's chest, a fear she had not known she was carrying until it eased. She said yes. The word left her before Lady Constance could intervene again, and once it was said, there was no graceful way for anyone in that room to pretend it had not been. The Duke inclined his head as though the matter were already settled and turned to make the necessary arrangements with the same unhurried authority he had crossed the room with, while behind him, the 30 guests began, in the low murmur of people who have just witnessed something they will describe differently in a dozen drawing rooms by evening, to reassemble the shattered pieces of their expectations for how that morning was supposed to go. Lady Constance waited only until the last carriage had rolled down the gravel drive before she summoned Margaret to the small parlor she used for matters she preferred conducted without witnesses. The room was cold despite the fire laid in the grate, or perhaps it only felt cold because of the expression on Lady Constance's face, a controlled fury that Margaret had learned to recognize from 100 smaller reckonings over the years. She was told, in a voice pitched low enough that the servants in the hall would not hear but sharp enough to leave no doubt of its intent, that she had embarrassed the family in front of half the county, that a companion did not accept commissions from dukes as though she were an equal in that transaction, and that whatever fantasy had taken root in her mind about her own importance would need to be uprooted before it grew any further. Margaret stood through the reprimand with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, the posture that had kept her safe in that house for nearly 2 decades, but something in her had shifted since the morning, some quiet certainty that had not existed in her before the Duke crossed that drawing room. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with Lady Constance only lengthened the punishment and rarely changed its outcome. She said only that she had been asked a direct question in front of witnesses and had answered honestly, and that refusing the Duke of Halworth in his own hearing would have been its own kind of scandal, one Lady Constance would have liked even less. It was not quite defiance, but it was closer to defiance than Margaret had allowed herself in years, and Lady Constance heard the difference even if she could not immediately name it. She informed Margaret that she would be permitted to travel to Halworth Park for the sittings, since refusing the Duke outright now was impossible without inviting exactly the kind of talk the family could not afford, but that she would travel with the housekeeper as chaperone, that she would conduct herself with the modesty appropriate to her station, and that she would remember, every single day she spent under that roof, precisely how much she owed the family that had raised her. Margaret absorbed each condition without protest, because protest cost more than it earned, but as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room above the linen store that evening, she found herself turning over the morning's events with something unfamiliar stirring beneath the practiced calm, a small and dangerous hope that perhaps her life did not have to remain exactly the shape Lady Constance had spent 19 years pressing it into. The carriage ride to Halworth Park took the better part of a morning, winding through lanes still muddy from spring rain, past hedgerows just beginning to green, and fields where sheep grazed with the unhurried confidence of animals that had never once been told they did not belong somewhere. Margaret sat across from the Elsmore housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who had shown her more small kindnesses over the years than anyone else under that roof, and who spent most of the journey glancing at Margaret with an expression that hovered between concern and something like pride. Margaret watched the countryside change as they traveled, the Ashby land giving way to Halworth land, with a shift she could feel before she could see it. The hedgerows better kept, the tenant cottages in better repair, the whole landscape carrying itself with the particular order of an estate managed by someone who paid close attention. She had brought her father's paint box, wedged carefully between her feet where the carriage's motion could not damage it, and she found herself running through the practicalities of the commission in her mind, as a way of keeping the larger, more frightening questions at bay. What light would the sitting room offer? What size canvas would suit a formal portrait of a man of his rank? Whether he would want to be shown in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his position, or somewhere plainer, and what that choice, if he made it, might reveal about how he wished to be seen. She had painted perhaps a dozen subjects in her life, none of them formal commissions, all of them chosen because something in their face or their bearing had caught her attention long enough to demand it be recorded. She did not know yet what had caught the Duke's attention in a small vestry miniature enough to bring him riding across the county on the strength of it, and the not knowing sat uneasily alongside the hope she had allowed herself to feel since the morning of the sitting. Halworth Park came into view as the carriage crested a low rise, a house built of pale stone that seemed to hold the grey daylight rather than reflect it, larger than Elsmore by a considerable margin, but carrying none of Elsmore's determined show, as though whoever had built it had not needed to convince anyone of anything. Margaret felt her chest tighten as the carriage rolled up the long drive, not with the old familiar dread of arriving somewhere she was not wanted, but with something closer to anticipation, sharp and unfamiliar and, she suspected, more dangerous than dread had ever been. The Duke received them himself in the entrance hall, which Margaret understood even before Mrs. Whitfield's small intake of breath beside her was not the ordinary custom of a house this size, where a master of his rank would typically leave such duties to a housekeeper or steward. He was dressed more plainly than he had been at Elsmore, his coat dark and unadorned, and he greeted Mrs. Whitfield with a courtesy that put the older woman visibly at ease before he turned his attention to Margaret and asked, without preamble, whether the journey had tired her, whether she required rest before beginning the work, whether the light in the room he had chosen would suit her needs, or whether she would prefer to choose another herself. The questions themselves were unremarkable, the sort any considerate host might ask, but Margaret had spent 19 years in a house where her preferences were rarely solicited and never acted upon, and the plain fact of being asked, and asked as though her answer mattered, settled over her with a strange, disorienting warmth. She told him the light mattered less than he might think, that a good painter worked with whatever was given, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face before he caught it and put it away again, as though smiling were a habit he had broken himself of and was not yet certain he trusted. He led them himself through a long gallery hung with portraits going back generations, Halworths in armor and Halworths in powdered wigs, and Halworths in the plain modern dress of the current decade, and Margaret found herself slowing despite her intention to keep pace, drawn by the sheer accumulated weight of history on those walls. The Duke noticed her slowing and did not hurry her. He stopped beside her instead, in front of a portrait of a woman with dark hair and a direct, unguarded gaze, and said in a voice quieter than any he had used yet, that this had been his wife Eleanor, and that she had been the one who taught him to see paintings as more than decoration. He offered no further explanation, and Margaret asked for none, understanding instinctively that the offering itself, brief as it was, constituted a kind of trust he did not extend easily. They walked on in a silence that felt, for the first time since Margaret had arrived, entirely comfortable, and when they reached the room he had chosen for the sittings, a modest chamber with tall windows facing north exactly as she would have requested had anyone asked, Margaret understood that something had already begun between them that had very little to do with paint or canvas at all. The first sitting began awkwardly, as first sittings often did, with the Duke seated stiffly in the chair Margaret had positioned near the north window, and Margaret herself uncertain how to direct a man of his rank without overstepping some boundary she could not yet see clearly. She asked him to turn his shoulders a fraction toward the light, and he complied at once, and she asked him to relax his hands from the fists they had unconsciously formed on the chair's arms, and he looked down at them as though surprised to find them clenched at all. She worked in silence for the better part of an hour, blocking in the basic architecture of his face and shoulders, and she found, as she often did with difficult subjects, that the silence itself began to do work that conversation could not, allowing her to see past the careful composure he wore like armor, to something underneath it, that shifted and reassembled itself the longer he sat still. He broke the silence first, asking what she saw when she looked at a face before she began to paint it, and Margaret considered the question honestly before answering that she looked for the thing a person tried hardest to hide, because that was usually the truest thing about them, and painting around it produced only a flattering lie dressed up as a likeness. The Duke was quiet for a long moment after that, and when he spoke again it was to ask, with a bluntness that startled her, what she thought he was hiding. Margaret set down her brush and studied him properly then, not as a subject to be rendered, but as a man sitting across a quiet room from her, and she said that she thought he had decided, some years past, that being seen clearly was a kind of danger, and that he had built a great deal of silence around himself to make certain no one attempted it again. She watched something move behind his eyes, not anger, which she had half expected and braced herself for, but something closer to recognition, as though she had said aloud a thing he had suspected about himself, but never heard confirmed by another person. He did not deny it. He asked instead, quietly, how she had learned to see so precisely, and Margaret found herself telling him, without entirely deciding to, about the mornings in the old nursery, about painting in secret because a girl with no dowry could not be seen wanting anything for herself, about the particular loneliness of loving something the people around her considered frivolous at best and improper at worst. She had not spoken so plainly about herself to anyone in years, and she was faintly astonished, once the words were out, at how much lighter she felt for having said them, as though some weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its shape had shifted, just slightly, onto someone else's shoulders for the first time in her life. The sittings continued through that week and into the next, each one lengthening a little beyond what strict necessity required, though neither Margaret nor the Duke remarked on it aloud. Mrs. Whitfield sat through most of them with her needlework, a chaperone in body if increasingly not in attention, since the conversation between painter and subject rarely strayed anywhere that required her intervention and mostly concerned matters of light and composition and, gradually, matters further afield. Margaret learned, in fragments offered without urgency, the shape of the Duke's grief, the way Eleanor's death had hollowed out 3 years of his life so thoroughly that he had, for a long stretch, forgotten what it felt like to want anything beyond the management of his estate and the maintenance of a silence he had mistaken for peace. He learned, in turn, the shape of Margaret's endurance, the particular discipline required to survive 19 years in a house that measured her worth in the smallness of her presence, the way she had built an entire private world of color and observation that no one had thought to take from her, only because no one had thought it worth taking. They did not speak of these things as confessions exactly, more as observations offered between two people slowly discovering that the other could be trusted with the truth, and Margaret found herself looking forward to the sittings with an anticipation she recognized, uneasily, as something closer to longing than professional interest. The portrait itself progressed slowly, because Margaret refused to rush toward a likeness that flattered without capturing what she actually saw, and because the Duke, once he understood what she was attempting, seemed content to let the work take whatever time it required. He asked her once, near the end of the second week, whether she painted this way with every subject, this slowness, this refusal to settle for anything less than the truth of a face, and Margaret admitted that she had never before been given the time to work this way, that every previous subject had been a stolen hour here and there, snatched between duties that could not be neglected. Something in his expression darkened briefly at that admission, a flash of something that might have been anger on her behalf, quickly banked but not quickly enough for her to miss it entirely. He said after a moment that he intended to change that whatever commission followed this one, and he said this with a certainty that implied there would be a following commission, would be conducted on terms that gave her work the respect it had always deserved and rarely received. Margaret did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and returned her attention to the canvas, though her hands were not quite steady enough, for several minutes afterward, to trust with the finer lines of his face. Word of Margaret's commission traveled through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandal dressed up as curiosity, and by the third week it had reached every drawing room within a day's ride, embellished in the retelling until the plain facts of a portrait sitting had become, in some versions, an engagement, and in others, something considerably less respectable. Lady Constance heard the worst of these versions first, delivered by a visiting cousin with poorly disguised relish, and spent the better part of an afternoon composing a letter to Margaret that took her housekeeper 3 attempts to deliver without weeping at its contents. The letter reminded Margaret, in language stripped of any pretense of warmth, that whatever attention the Duke had shown her was a temporary curiosity that men of his rank occasionally indulged in and just as quickly abandoned, that she had no family name or fortune to make such attention respectable, and that she would do well to remember her place before she embarrassed herself and the family that had housed her for 19 years beyond what any obligation required. Margaret read the letter twice in the privacy of the room Halworth Park had given her, a room larger and better appointed than anything she had known at Elsmore, and found that its words, which would once have sent her into a spiral of anxious self-doubt lasting days, landed instead with a strange, muted quality, as though they belonged to a version of her life she was already beginning to leave behind. She did not answer the letter immediately. She sat instead by the window with the portrait's latest study spread across her lap, a study of the Duke's hands that she had spent 2 full sittings perfecting, because his hands, she had discovered, told a truer story than his carefully composed face ever would. tension held in the knuckles even when his expression gave nothing away. She thought about Lady Constance's certainty that this attention would prove temporary, that a man of the Duke's rank could not possibly mean anything lasting by the time he had given her, and she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, questioning whether Lady Constance's certainty about anything deserved the weight she had always given it. She wrote back eventually, a short letter that thanked Lady Constance for her concern and said nothing else at all, no promises of restraint, no reassurances that she understood her place, and she sent it off with a calm that surprised her more than it should have, given how thoroughly that calm represented a woman she had never before been permitted to become. The Duke found her in the gallery one gray afternoon when the day's sitting had been cut short by failing light, standing before the portrait of Eleanor that he had shown her on her first day at Hallworth Park, and he did not immediately announce his presence, choosing instead to watch her study his late wife's face with the same careful attention she brought to every subject worth her attention. When he finally spoke, asking what she saw when she looked at Eleanor's portrait, Margaret answered honestly that she saw a woman who had been deeply loved and had known it, which was rarer in portraiture than people assumed, since most subjects sat for painters who saw only their rank or their beauty and rendered accordingly, missing entirely the harder thing underneath. The Duke absorbed this for a long moment before admitting that he had commissioned that portrait himself, in the first year of their marriage, from a painter considerably more celebrated than Margaret, and that he had never once looked at it and felt what he felt looking at the unfinished study of his own hands that Margaret had left drying in the sitting room that morning. He said this plainly, without the careful distance he usually maintained around anything resembling feeling, and Margaret understood that he was telling her something significant, something that required more courage from a man like him than most people would ever guess. She asked, carefully, whether it troubled him, being seen so clearly by someone who was not his wife, and he was quiet long enough that she began to regret the question, before he said that it had troubled him greatly, in the beginning, and that it troubled him considerably less now, and that he was not entirely certain what to make of the change. Margaret felt something shift in her chest at that admission, a recognition that they had crossed, without either of them quite marking the moment, from painter and subject into something considerably less easily named. She told him, because the gallery's quiet seemed to invite an honesty she rarely permitted herself, that she had received a letter from Lady Constance warning her that his attention would prove temporary, the kind of curiosity a man of his rank indulged and discarded without consequence to himself. The Duke's expression hardened at that, not toward her but toward the letter's absent author, and he said with a quiet vehemence that startled her that Lady Constance Ashby had spent 19 years teaching a remarkable woman to expect nothing, and that he intended to spend considerably longer than 19 years proving to Margaret that she had been wrong about every part of it. Margaret did not trust herself to answer that immediately, and the two of them stood together in the gallery's gray light, neither speaking, both aware that something had been declared between them that neither was yet ready to name aloud. It was Mrs. Whitfield who first noticed the child, a small girl of perhaps 6 who appeared at the edge of the Hallworth Gardens most afternoons, watching the house from a distance with the particular stillness of a child who had learned that approaching too closely invited being sent away. She mentioned it to Margaret in passing, more curiosity than concern, and Margaret found herself watching for the girl during her own walks between sittings, drawn by something in the child's posture that reminded her uncomfortably of her own younger self, hovering at the edges of rooms she was not certain she belonged in. She learned eventually, from one of the undergardeners, that the girl was the daughter of a tenant family on the estate's far boundary, that her mother had died the previous winter of a fever that had taken half the cottages along that lane, and that her father, a proud man unwilling to accept charity even when his daughter went hungry for it, had forbidden her from approaching the great house directly, though he had apparently not managed to forbid her from watching it from a safe distance. Margaret approached the girl herself one afternoon, slowly and without any sudden movement, the way she might approach a wary animal, and offered nothing more demanding than a seat beside her on the low garden wall and a piece of bread saved from her own luncheon. The girl, whose name was Alice, did not speak for the first several minutes, but she did not run either, and by the time the light began to fail she had told Margaret, in the halting fragments of a child unused to being listened to, that she liked to watch the house because her mother used to say the Duke was a kind man underneath his quiet, and that watching the house made her feel closer to a version of the world where her mother's words might still be true. Margaret carried that conversation back to the house with her, and found herself, without entirely planning to, repeating it to the Duke that evening as he sat for what was meant to be a brief final study of his profile before the light failed entirely. He set down whatever composure he had been holding almost the instant she finished speaking, asking sharp, urgent questions about which tenant family, which cottage, how long the child had been going without proper care, and Margaret watched something in him come alive that she had not yet seen in 3 weeks of careful sittings, an intensity of concern that cut through every layer of practiced distance he otherwise maintained. He left the house within the hour, on foot rather than waiting for a horse to be saddled, and returned well after dark, having personally seen to arrangements for the tenant family that Margaret would only learn the full extent of days later, and she understood, watching him return soaked from an evening rain with mud on his boots and no complaint on his lips, that she had just witnessed the wound beneath his silence finally finding somewhere useful to spend itself. The following morning, the Duke told her, over a breakfast she had not expected to share with him, the story he had never told anyone at Halworth Park beyond his steward, who had needed to know it in order to manage the estate's records correctly. Eleanor's child, the one who had not survived the night of her death, had been a daughter, and in the delirium of her final hours, Eleanor had made him promise that whatever grief came after, he would not let it close him off from the tenant children on the estate, the way his own father's grief had closed his father off from him after his mother's death decades before. He had meant to keep that promise. For the first year after Eleanor died, he had genuinely tried, visiting the tenant cottages, seeing to the children's welfare with the attentiveness Eleanor had asked of him, but the visits had grown harder rather than easier, each small face a reminder of the daughter he would never see grow into one, until eventually he had stopped visiting at all and told himself the estate's steward could manage such matters just as well without him. He had not, until the previous evening, understood how completely he had broken that promise, nor how much a single afternoon of a lonely child's company, relayed to him by a woman he had known only 3 weeks, could crack open 3 years of carefully maintained distance in the space of a single conversation. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting, understanding instinctively that he needed to say it in full before he could hear anything she might say in response, and when he finally finished, she told him, gently, that grief did not require a person to keep every promise perfectly in order to be worth making, that the fact he had gone out into the rain the moment he understood his failure said more about the man he actually was than 3 years of avoided visits ever could about the man he feared he had become. He looked at her then with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something unguarded and almost young, and admitted that he had not realized, before this commission began, how much he had needed someone to say precisely that to him, plainly and without the careful diplomatic softening most people in his position offered, instead of honesty. Margaret felt the weight of that admission settle between them, heavier and more significant than anything spoken in the gallery days before, and she understood that whatever was growing between them had moved past the careful, deniable territory of painter and subject into something that would require, soon, an honesty from both of them that neither had yet found the courage to offer fully. News of the Duke's sudden and visible attention to the tenant family reached Elsmore within days, carried by the same gossiping channels that had spread word of the commission itself. And this time the story arrived with an added detail that struck Lady Constance far harder than any rumor of romance had managed to. The Duke of Halworth, famous throughout the county for his silence and his distance, had apparently spent an entire evening in the rain arranging care for a tenant child, on the direct urging of the very companion Lady Constance had spent 19 years training to expect nothing and want less. It was one thing, in Lady Constance's calculation, to dismiss a duke's temporary fascination with an unremarkable woman as the passing curiosity such men sometimes indulged. It was another thing entirely to watch that fascination produce visible, consequential change in a man the entire county had considered permanently closed off, because that kind of change suggested an influence considerably more durable than mere curiosity ever produced. Lady Constance summoned Henrietta to her private parlor that same evening and spoke to her with unusual bluntness about the shifting shape of the family's prospects, reminding her daughter that the engagement to the baronet's son, while respectable, represented considerably less advancement than a connection to Halworth Park might have offered had matters been arranged differently, had someone in the family thought to cultivate the Duke's interest before Margaret's inconvenient miniature ever came to his attention. Henrietta, who had watched her mother orchestrate every significant decision of her life without complaint, found herself, for once, unwilling to simply agree, pointing out with a directness that surprised them both that Margaret had done nothing except paint honestly and answer a direct question, and that resenting her for a duke's genuine regard seemed considerably less dignified than accepting that some things could not be engineered through careful maneuvering. Lady Constance did not appreciate the observation, and the conversation ended with considerably more tension than either of them had entered it carrying. But something in Henrietta's willingness to defend her cousin, however mildly, marked a small crack in the family's united front that Lady Constance noted with real alarm. She spent that night composing a second letter to Margaret, this one considerably sharper than the first, informing her in language that left no room for misunderstanding that she expected Margaret to conclude the commission at the earliest possible opportunity and return to Elsmore before her presence at Halworth Park caused talk that could not be undone, and that failure to comply would result in consequences Lady Constance did not fully specify, but clearly intended Margaret to imagine in the worst possible terms. The second letter arrived at Halworth Park on a morning when Margaret had finally reached the stage of the portrait she found most demanding, the final layering of the Duke's eyes, the part of any face that determined whether a portrait merely resembled its subject or actually captured him, and she read Lady Constance's words with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from a fury she did not immediately recognize as her own. So unfamiliar was the sensation after 19 years of practiced submission. She set the letter aside and returned to her work because the light would not wait for her feelings to settle, and it was in the careful, demanding concentration of matching pigment to the exact gray-brown of the Duke's eyes that she found herself thinking, with a clarity she had not previously allowed herself, about what her life might actually look like if she simply refused to return to Elsmore at all. The thought frightened her with its scale, because a woman without a dowry or a family name did not, by any rule she had ever been taught, get to make such choices for herself, and yet the thought would not entirely leave her, returning each time she glanced up from the canvas to the man sitting patiently across the room, watching her work with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with something considerably more difficult to name. She told him about the letter that evening, not because she intended to burden him with it, but because she found, increasingly, that she did not wish to keep such things from him, and he read Lady Constance's words with a stillness that Margaret had learned, over 3 weeks, to recognize as the particular quiet he wore just before anger, controlled and precise rather than explosive. He asked, when he finished reading, whether Margaret wished to return to Elsmore, and she found the honest answer easier to give than she expected. That she did not wish it, that she had not wished it for longer than she had allowed herself to admit, but that wishing and being permitted rarely occupied the same territory in a life like hers. The Duke folded the letter carefully and set it aside, and told her, in a voice that carried none of his usual restraint, that he did not intend to send her back to a house that had spent 19 years teaching her that her own wishes carried no weight, that the portrait would take however long the portrait required, and that whatever came after the portrait was a conversation he intended to have with her directly, not one he intended to let Lady Constance Ashby settle through threatening letters written from a house Margaret had never truly belonged to in the first place. The portrait was finished on a bright morning in the 4th week, the kind of clear spring light Margaret had been waiting for through weeks of gray skies, and she stepped back from the canvas with the particular exhaustion and elation that only came at the completion of work she had poured everything true in her into. The Duke stood beside her, studying his own likeness for a long, silent minute, and Margaret watched his face for some sign of his reaction, understanding that whatever he said in the next few moments would tell her something important, not just about the portrait, but about whether she had succeeded in the harder task underneath it, the task of painting him as he actually was, rather than as convention required a duke to be rendered. He did not speak immediately. He reached out instead and touched the frame's edge, not the canvas itself, with a care that suggested he understood exactly how much of himself lived in the paint, and when he finally spoke, it was to say that no one, in 31 years of his life, had ever looked at him closely enough to paint what she had painted, the tiredness held just behind the eyes, the tension in hands that had spent 3 years clenched around a grief he had never let anyone else see. He said it was the first portrait of himself he had ever looked at and recognized entirely, and that recognition, offered by a woman who had spent 19 years being told her own perception counted for nothing, struck Margaret with a force she had not anticipated, tears rising before she could steady herself against them. She had painted difficult truths into faces before, the vicar's quiet loneliness, the gardener's old grief for a wife long buried, but she had never before painted someone who looked back at what she had captured and thanked her for the honesty rather than flinching from it. The Duke turned from the portrait to look at her directly and told her that he had commissioned this painting under a pretense he owed her the honesty to finally abandon, that he had not ridden across the county on the strength of a vestry miniature merely because the brushwork impressed him, though it had, but because something in the honesty of that small painting had told him the artist behind it saw the world in a way he had forgotten how to, and he had wanted, more than he had wanted anything in 3 years, to be seen that way himself, even if it meant confronting everything he had spent that time avoiding. Margaret understood, standing in that bright room with the finished portrait between them, that the commission had never truly been about the painting at all, that it had been from the very first moment his gaze crossed the Elsmore drawing room and found her, about two people who had each spent years being unseen, finally recognizing the one person capable of changing that, and she found herself, for the first time in her adult life, uncertain what to do with a happiness this large and this unguarded. The Duke announced, within days of the portrait's completion, that he intended to host a gathering at Hallworth Park to unveil it formally, an event to which he extended invitations across the entire county, including, with what Margaret understood to be deliberate precision, every family who had attended the ill-fated sitting at Elsmore a month before. She protested at first, understanding all too well what such an event would cost her if it went wrong, the public exposure of a woman whose position in society had never been secure enough to withstand the kind of scrutiny a grand unveiling would invite. The Duke listened to her concerns without dismissing them, and told her that he understood the risk she would be taking, but that he had spent 3 years hiding from exactly this kind of exposure, and had learned, in the month since she arrived at Hallworth Park, that hiding preserved nothing worth preserving, only postponed the reckoning that eventually came for everyone regardless. He asked her, plainly, whether she trusted him to stand beside her through whatever the evening brought, and Margaret found that she did, entirely, and without the reservation she might once have expected to feel toward a promise of that size. The days leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of preparation. The household staff transformed the great hall with a diligence that spoke to genuine affection for their master, rather than mere obligation, and Margaret found herself, in quiet moments between the preparations, standing before the finished portrait and marveling at what her own hands had produced, a likeness that had already begun, in the small circles of the household who had seen it, to earn the kind of quiet admiration she had spent her whole life believing her work could never command. Mrs. Whitfield, who had remained at Hallworth Park throughout the commission and had watched the entire transformation unfold at close range, told Margaret one evening that she had never in her years of service seen two people arrive at an understanding so completely, without a single dramatic declaration, that it had simply happened, quietly, in the space between careful conversations and unguarded silences, the way the truest things in life generally did. Margaret found comfort in that observation, because she had spent the past month waiting, some deep and cautious part of her, for the entire arrangement to reveal itself as a mistake, a kindness extended by a lonely man that would evaporate the moment the portrait was finished, and the pretense of the commission no longer bound them together. The unveiling would settle that question for good, she understood, one way or another, in front of every person who had ever taught her to expect nothing, and she found herself dreading and anticipating the evening in equal measure as the appointed date drew steadily closer. The evening of the unveiling arrived with the great hall at Hallworth Park lit by more candles than Margaret had ever seen gathered in a single room, their light catching the gold thread in the curtains and the polished surfaces of furniture that had clearly not been used for entertaining in the 3 years since Eleanor's death. And Margaret understood, watching the staff move through their final preparations with visible pride, exactly how significant this gathering was for a household that had spent so long in careful, grieving quiet. The guests began arriving as dusk settled fully into night, and Margaret watched from a small antechamber as carriage after carriage rolled up the drive, recognizing many of the families who had witnessed her humiliation at Elsmore a month before, and feeling her composure tested with each new arrival, until the Ashby carriage itself appeared, Lady Constance emerging with her face arranged into the particular smile she wore when concealing displeasure from an audience that mattered. The Duke found Margaret in the antechamber moments before the formal unveiling was set to begin, and he did not offer reassurances or rehearsed words of comfort, understanding by now that Margaret required neither, but simply took her hand, plainly and without concealment, in a gesture that would be seen by every guest the moment they walked together into the hall, and asked whether she was ready. Margaret found that she was more ready than she had expected to feel, some final reserve of fear having quietly burned away in the month since the portrait began, replaced by a steadiness she recognized as entirely her own rather than borrowed from his confidence. They walked into the great hall together, and the room's collective attention shifted toward them exactly as it had shifted toward Margaret alone at Elsmore a month before, though the quality of that attention had transformed entirely. Curiosity now mixed with something that, on several faces, looked distinctly like reassessment. The Duke led her to the front of the hall, where the covered portrait waited on its easel, and addressed the assembled guests directly, thanking them for attending an occasion he considered among the most significant of his life, before explaining, in the same plain, unhurried voice he used for every important thing he said, that the portrait beneath the covering had been painted by a woman whose talent he considered equal to any artist working in England, and whose honesty, patience, and quiet strength had done more to restore him to himself in a single month than 3 years of solitary grief had managed on his own. He turned then to Margaret, and asked her, in front of every guest who had ever overlooked her, whether she would do him the honor of unveiling her own work, and Margaret stepped forward, her hands steady now, in a way they had not been steady at the sitting a month before, and drew back the covering to reveal, finally, to the entire assembled county, exactly what she had always been capable of. The room fell silent as the covering came away, and Margaret watched the faces of guests who had spent a month exchanging rumors about her transform, one by one, into something closer to genuine astonishment, because the portrait before them was not merely accomplished, it was extraordinary, a likeness so honest and so alive that several guests would later admit to feeling, standing before it, as though the Duke himself might turn his head and speak. Lady Constance stood near the back of the assembled crowd, her carefully arranged smile faltering as she absorbed not just the quality of the work but the visible, undeniable regard with which the Duke looked at its creator, a regard that made every word of her 2 dismissive letters feel, in that moment, both cruel and profoundly foolish. The Duke did not let the silence stretch uncomfortably. He spoke again, once the initial murmur of admiration had settled, and told the assembled guests that he intended to commission a great deal more work from this particular artist, beginning with a portrait of the estate's tenant families, whose faces deserved recording with the same honesty and care he had received himself, and that Margaret Ashby would henceforth be received at Haworth Park not as a companion or a poor relation, but as an artist of genuine and growing reputation, welcome in his home for as long as she wished to grace it. He paused then, and the pause carried a weight that made the entire room lean, almost imperceptibly, toward him, before he continued, saying that he hoped, in time, she might consider making that welcome permanent, a hope he intended to pursue properly and formally in the days ahead, but one he saw no reason to hide tonight from the very people who had spent so long failing to see her worth at all. Margaret felt the room's attention settle on her with a warmth entirely unlike the cold scrutiny of the Elsmore sitting a month before, and she found Henrietta's face in the crowd, genuinely smiling, and found even Lady Constance's expression, beneath its shock, carrying something that might, with time, soften into a grudging acceptance of what had happened, whether she had sanctioned it or not. The Duke turned to Margaret once more, in front of every witness who mattered, and asked, quietly enough that it belonged to the 2 of them even amid the crowded hall, whether she would stay, not merely for another commission but for the life he was clumsily and sincerely offering to build alongside her, one measured in honest mornings and unguarded evenings rather than any title or fortune attached to it. Margaret looked past him at the portrait, at the version of himself he had trusted her to reveal, and then back at the man who had crossed a crowded room a month ago to find the one person no one else had thought worth painting, and she opened her mouth to answer him in front of everyone who had ever told her she was worth nothing at all.